Speaking of right-wing inability to see beyond their own reflection in a mirror. And I say beyond their own reflection in a mirror because we know that right-wingers are largely older and white, just demographically speaking. Men, also a big part of that right-wing coalition. And I talked yesterday at some length in the better half of the program about the right-wing's assault. And we've been talking about this for days. The right-wing assault on women's rights. And this seems to be some type of electoral strategy for them. It's not enough that Sandra Fluke, a woman who simply testified in front of Congress about the need for access, full access to the contraceptive pill for health reasons aside from pregnancy prevention, among other students at Georgetown Law, despite the fact that Rush Limbaugh has now lost over 150 sponsors, that so much so that his national ad buying syndicator had to put a moratorium on trying to sell those ads for a couple of weeks. Despite the fact that you've got more than 6 in 10 respondents in a Bloomberg national poll, including almost 70% of women, saying they don't appreciate the stance of the right wing on this. Sandra Fluke, you now have right-wingers who are combing the web to find information on her boyfriend, on her boyfriend's family, on her boyfriend's grandparents, on vacations they have taken together. I mean, this is, by any definition, stalking, harassment. I think there are laws on the books that if this woman was in her teens, that these people, what they're printing about her and what they're investigating about her for having the audacity of being a woman and testifying in front of Congress, I think they could be brought up on charges.
We're not ready for hell, hell no, for hell, hell no, for days wide awake, why slide along and say, girl's afraid, girl will change, just move away. For days that I mention in a song, move along, get ahead, get her hand and bring her with you. I know you feel it too, these words get overused when we get up and
Maybe that explains why. And I talked about this when I filled in for Olbermann, I think it was a couple of weeks ago. Why Republicans in the Senate are refusing to renew the Violence Against Women Act. That was just 15, 20 years ago, a completely bipartisan, non-controversial bill. It is the renewal, granted, would expand financing, but we're talking about an infinitesimal small amount of the budget, and broaden the reach of domestic violence programs. Even Senator Lisa Murkowski of Alaska, a Republican, now granted, she's a woman, so she's not a full-fledged Republican. I think if you're a woman in the Republican Party, you're like a 7/8 full-on, you get voting rights, but you have to raise your hand before you talk to one of your Republican colleagues. Warned her colleagues that the party was at risk of being successfully painted as anti-woman. Really? Really? You know why they're at risk of being painted successfully as anti-woman? Because someone with the least amount of artistic skill, someone without fingers and hands and arms and a mouth and toes, could wedge a paintbrush in between their knees and paint this successfully. The legislation would continue existing grant programs to local enforcement and battered women's shelters. Oh, really? But here's the big but, it would expand efforts to reach Indian tribes in rural areas. You know, if you're a woman and you're living in a rural area and you can't handle the fact that you're going to get beaten by your domestic partner, you know what? You should move closer to the city. You chose to live out there. You thought it was so nice in the country, or maybe you don't have the money to buy a second house in the city or out in Aspen. You got to come.
Concrete can't rise up. Better weather across the land like a giant rock house. War slide down below. Foundations of buildings that are better run. People here got it real good. Get the blast out spring. Prepare us day. And other people off in the streets. Concrete don't know.
It would also, and this is just repugnant, increase the availability of free legal assistance to victims of domestic violence. It's not always the case, but I suspect there's a decent amount of cases that when you're being battered by your husband, let's say, you don't necessarily have access to a lot of funds to go out and get a lawyer. It would extend the definition of violence against women to include stalking, and maybe that's part of the problem, because without the opportunity to stalk, how would half these right-wing websites have anything to write about these days? They wouldn't be able to write about how Jewish Sandra Fluke's boyfriend is. And if you think I'm making that up, just Google Sandra Fluke Jewish. It is stunning. This is what a couple of the 7/8 member of the right-wing crowd, they're 7/8 because they're women, Janice Shaw Krause, a senior fellow at the conservative Concerned Women for America, said her group has been pressing senators hard to oppose reauthorization of the legislation she called a boondoggle. Because it, quote, creates an ideology that all men are guilty and all women are victims.
Why can't I walk down a street? Your suggestion. Why can't I walk down a street? Free suggestion.
Last month on the conservative website townhall.com, conservative icon Phyllis Schlafly called the Violence Against Women Act a slush fund used to fill feminist coffers, and demanded that Republicans stand up against legislation that, quote, promotes divorce, breakup of marriage, and hatred of men. Well, I hope someone in the Republican Party gave her a nice pat on the head, because for a 7/8 member of the right wing, she really done well. Unbelievable. I thought my capacity to be shocked by these people had been exhausted. And almost every day, it's just something, it's like spring every day for their vehement hatred of anything or anyone that in some way could help, and again, could help and somehow empower anybody who has not been part of the power structure from which they came.
Honest to goodness, the bars went open this morning. They must have been voting for your president or something. Do you have a quarter? I said yes because I did. Honest to goodness, the truth's been falling all over this country.
And can we tell also from online what Sandra Fluke is going to be doing with her boyfriend on the 19th? Has that been established yet by these right-wing bloggers, what their plans are for the weekend? Un-effing believable. It's just, they should be arrested en masse and see how they like their NDAA at that point. Can we get the drones to fly over them?
The Motor City. This is supposed to be the new world. Don't forget the Motor City. This is supposed to be the new world.
Greece has officially defaulted on its debt to private lenders. It was an orderly default, of course. In other words, they cut a deal. But he says that even with this debt relief, the story is not over, because you still have, in exchange for that debt relief, a requirement by the Greeks to continue to impose austerity on its people. And as we have said on this program, and by reading Krugman and others, that when you contract government at a time in which you are in a recession, or the private side of your economy is not creating economic activity to provide jobs, et cetera, when you contract government, when you reduce government spending, when you try and shrink the deficit, you create a cycle of an ever-increasing lack of economic activity. And as he says, what the Greek experience shows is that while running deficits in good times can get you in trouble, which is indeed the story for Greece, although not Spain, because Spain had low government debt and a budget surplus on the eve of its economic crisis. Trying to eliminate deficits once you're already in trouble is a recipe for depression. Take, for example, Ireland, which imposed its own version of austerity and has seen unemployment grow, has seen their economy shrink. Their unemployment rate now near 15%. Their real GDP down by double digits. And he says Portugal and Spain are in similar dire straits. There is growing evidence that it is self-defeating, even in purely fiscal terms. In other words, even if your goal is to cut the deficit, rather than to provide economic activity for your country or jobs for your people, even if your goal is to cut the deficit, cutting spending actually has the opposite effect, because when you decrease economic activity, you also decrease your revenue, because revenue comes from taxes. Taxes comes from an increase in economic activity. And he goes on to say that the then president of the European Central Bank, Jean-Claude Trichet, in June 2010, said that the idea austerity measures could trigger stagnation is incorrect. Well, it turns out Jean-Claude Trichet was incorrectamundo. And he says, what is the alternative to countries like Greece and Ireland? What alternatives did they have? The answer is that they had and they have no good alternative short of leaving the euro so that they can inflate their way out of this debt and basically gain control of their economy. He said in its extreme step that realistically their leaders cannot take until all other options have failed. And he thinks that Greece is rapidly approaching that. He says that Germany and the European Central Bank could take action by demanding less austerity and doing more to boost the European economy as a whole. But the main point, that America does have an alternative. We have our own currency. We can borrow long-term at historically low interest rates, so we don't need to enter a downward spiral of austerity and economic contraction, which we are still, I think, teetering on. Because we're going to see more contraction in state and city governments And while at least in the last two jobs reports, the government has not been a drag on economic growth because it's only cut, I think it was 7,000 last month and 1,000 last month, 7,000 the year before, the month before. We could see another round where we start to lose more government jobs, and it eats into the recovery to the extent that there is one.
I started a joke which started the whole world crying, but I didn't see that the joke was on me. Oh,
He's helping out his son. The Daily Mash has a Why I'm Leaving the Empire by Darth Vader. After almost 12 years, first as a summer intern, then in the Death Star, and now in London, I believe I've worked here long enough to understand the trajectory of this culture. I mean, yes, this parody of this op-ed by someone leaving Goldman Sachs today. There is sort of this quality of like, incidentally, this guy who's leaving Goldman Sachs after 12 years, I don't know if Wikipedia has an entry for FU money, but that's what this guy's got. And so, you know, is he brave for coming out and saying this? Yeah, man. His buddies from Goldman Sachs may not come and visit him on his 150-acre horse farm in Putnam County or Westchester. And he may have to swim in his Olympic-sized pool all by his lonesome. I mean, I'm glad the guy wrote it for what it's worth, but do not count me amongst those who thinks this guy deserves any type of real applause. He basically just says, Goldman Sachs over the past 12 years, the culture has really changed. These guys now are openly hostile to their own clients. Oh, could someone please send me a reminder that when I have my millions of dollars from all the members who's going to sign up for this program, not to go to Goldman Sachs and have them invest it for me? Because it sounds like they're just there to screw over their clients.
Now, I'm not one to get all excited. I'm seldom tense and I'm never uptight. But there's one thing in this world that really makes me upset. And that's them coin machines, them nickel and dimers, them out of orders, them work one-timers, those nickel and dime quarter grubbing monsters. I mean, how many times have you had the munchies so you whip out a dime for some peanut crunches, you put it in a slot, you pull the handle, and just nut that. So you cuss and you beat it till your hand is blue, you push and you shove and you kick it with your shoe, and finally you just walk away while it's blinking. Thank you, which is machine, but we just stuck it to you, son. I'd like to meet the man who invented the coin machine. He must have hated mankind and every other living thing. I bet he had a motto on his wall in prose and rhyme, saying, you get nothing for a nickel, twice as much for a dime.
And suck fees out of them. I don't know if any of this is in any way surprising. When the history books are written about Goldman Sachs, they may reflect that the current chief executive officer Lloyd Blankfein and the president Gary D. Cohn lost hold of the firm's culture on their watch. My clients have a total asset base of more than $1 trillion. I've always taken a lot of pride in advising my clients to do what I believe is right for them, even if it means less money for the firm. The view is becoming increasingly unpopular at Goldman Sachs. I mean, it goes on to talk about how the people at Goldman have essentially turned into the people at Bear Stearns. That's basically it. Like 20 years ago, a buddy of mine was working in one of those, I think he was at Bear Stearns. And he he was basically a salesman type of guy. And he brought me in there, and, 20 years ago, if you guys think I dress sort of schlubbily now, 20 years ago, I was at my peak schlubbitude. And I walked into this huge bullpen area, and I had never seen anything like this before in my life. And all I remember is like one guy who couldn't have been older than I was at the time, early 20s, getting up and sort of like fist pumping because he had just sold some old senior citizen into some piece of crap. I don't think the culture has changed dramatically, certainly not in the industry. It's just that now Goldman Sachs is like one of those horrible boiler rooms. Goldman Sachs has turned into Bear Stearns. And this guy has come out and said, I'm embarrassed by it. My bronze medal in the Maccabee Games ping pong tournament sits on my desk, and I can't look at that with the same measure of pride because of how I've tainted myself. I'm going to have to take an extra 20 minutes in the sauna today. My own personal sauna. To feel better about it.
So sweet. Money changes everything. Money is the root of all evil. Money is the root of all evil. Money is the root of all evil. Money is the root of all evil.
In Mississippi, only 12% of GOP voters believe that President Obama is a Christian. Of course, 52% believe he is a Muslim. 36% aren't sure. Waiting for Jesus to come and tell them. In Alabama, 14% believe that Obama is a Christian. And 45% believe he's a Muslim. 41% aren't sure. So I guess Jesus has to stop off first in Mississippi and then head over to Alabama. Unbelievable. One of the problems that we're having, folks, is that our country is incredibly stupid. And I don't mean the land. I don't mean the dirt. I'm talking about there's a lot of stupid people in this country. And I know, Sam, come on. If you say they're stupid, you're not going to be able to convince them of anything. I got news for you. I'm not going to be able to convince these people of anything. I think we all have to resign ourselves to the fact that there are some very, very large swaths of people in this country who are just stupid. Lost causes. That's okay. We can say that. That doesn't mean that, look, I don't hate them because they're stupid. It's just a fact of life. Sometimes it rains. Sometimes, if we didn't have stupid people, we wouldn't be able to appreciate the smart people. If we were all stupid.
Or all smart.
Or all smart. No. If we were all smart, that's right. We wouldn't be able to appreciate how smart we are. I actually, you know what? I may have to go back on that. I don't know. I actually think that would be a good thing. I don't think it would be bad. I actually think it would be a good thing if we were all smart. But that's just not the way it's going to happen. But at least we're not all stupid. Although, if we were all stupid, that might be better, too.
I went down to get some extra brew. I filled the tank with Elmer's glue. Now the 4 on the floor doesn't work anymore. I'm pacing to the parking lot at Lucky's. The tailpipe is spitting out Elmer's galore. It looks like I'm gonna be stuck here all night. Been on a diet now for 18 years. A daily regimen of chips and beer.
It's a pleasure to welcome to the program Richard Kahlenberg. He is the co-author of both an op-ed in the New York Times and the forthcoming book, Why Labor Organizing Should Be a Civil Right. He co-authored that with Moshe Marvit. Welcome to the program.
Oh, well, thanks so much for having me.
All right, I want to start with, and one thing I think that people don't understand in this country is how really restricted in many respects people are in terms of their right to unionize and also to protest or to strike in a union, and much of that comes from the Taft-Hartley law, as far as I can tell, and I guess subsequent revisions. Can you speak to that?
Sure. We're really an international outlier on this country, on this issue. If you look at Freedom House, which is an organization that evaluates freedom throughout the world on a number of different criteria, they rate us as having a less free country with respect to labor organizing than 41 other nations, all our competitors. And the major problem in this country is that if you try to organize a union, the employer is very likely to fire you. And that's technically illegal under the labor laws, but the penalties are so incredibly weak that a firm that wants to prevent unionizing will just pay the penalty as kind of a cost of doing business. So in this country, there really isn't the genuine freedom to join a labor union, which is why we've seen this enormous collapse in the strength of organized labor. We used to have 35% of the private sector workers in unions, and today it's down to less than 7%.
And so, has that been a change in the law, or has that always existed? We've just had other laws that have basically been rolled back that allow for the full exercise of this right to join a union and protest in the context of being in the union.
Right. Well, as you point out, in 1947, the Taft-Hartley Act did weaken our labor laws, but the problem of the weak penalties has always been there. What's changed over time is that the culture in this country has allowed corporations to exploit weaknesses in the law. Throughout the 1940s, the 1950s, even into the 60s, there was a general consensus in this country that people have the right to organize and that labor unions were a credible way of keeping peace in the workforce by allowing employees and employers to come together at the bargaining table and hash out their differences. But then, beginning in the 70s and the 80s, really with Ronald Reagan, you saw a change in the culture where corporations started hiring union-busting consultants who would come in and figure out every way to prevent unions from organizing. So it's really a combination of laws that have been fairly weak all along, but then a change in the culture that has been exploited in recent years, making it much more difficult to organize a union.
And that was sort of that wasn't just a project by Ronald Reagan when he was president. I mean, he really started that shortly after, I guess, being president of a union. He then went on. He was hired by I think it was Bullware, right, at General Electric, and then sort of crisscrossed the country, teaching people to be suspicious of unions.
Well, that's right. I mean, the irony, of course, is that Ronald Reagan recognized the value of unions in other countries, right? And he was a strong proponent of the solidarity movement in Poland, and correctly so. I mean, that's one of the great chapters in the history in opposition to communism, and the way workers banded together and overthrew an autocratic regime in Poland. That was, and Reagan recognized that. But then in this country, he had a very different view, and really did a lot to set back the rights of workers to organize in this country.
Before we get into sort of how you construct how this the right to organizing would be a civil right, I want to just sort of point out, sort of some deficiencies in the rights that we have as Americans to practice protest in the context of a union. One piece that's already been written about your op-ed by Eric Alterman, he cites Josh Idelson in these times that political groups have every right to boycott advertisers and funders who support a cause of which they disapprove, but labor unions don't have that same right to act against supporters of the employers who seek to break their strike. In other words, they don't have the same rights to sort of boycott or organize against suppliers, or they can't do secondary strikes. Explain that to people, because I don't think there's a full realization of just how much your rights get curtailed if you're doing it under the auspices of a union.
Well, that's correct. That was part of the Taft-Hartley reform in 1947. They did away with the so-called secondary boycott, where a union could join with another union someplace else and come together to strike against a supplier or a secondary party, and that had an enormous impact in reducing the power of labor unions to address their rights in this country. The Taft-Hartley Act, by the way, I mean, if you look at the politics of this, Republicans had a very narrow window in which to act, and they saw that with the New Deal, they were really worried that the Democratic Party was going to become the majority, kind of a permanent majority in this country, and they knew exactly where to apply the legal pressure and pass this legislation to outlaw the secondary boycott and other tools that labor might use, and it had the desired effect.
Sing what force on earth could be weaker than the feeble strength of one like me, remembering the way it could have been. So help me with this barricade, no surrender, no defeat. A specter's haunting Albert Street. I am
Is there any other example in American political life where your involvement, your membership in a group like that would curtail your rights in such a way? I mean, I'm trying, to sort of think of an analogy, and I can't quite come up with one.
I don't know of any other example. I think it's really extraordinary.
Has anyone ever challenged that part of the Taft-Hartley amendment? Now, this amended the National Labor Relations Act in 47. It essentially it outlawed sort of organized general strikes by unions, right?
That's right.
Has anybody ever challenged the constitutionality of this?
I haven't followed the constitutional question, but I know that in 1964, 65, 66, in that era, there was an attempt to repeal provisions of Taft-Hartley, which, Johnson had a majority in both houses of Congress, and this seemed like a good time to move forward on labor law reform. But labor efforts to change the labor laws in this country have been extremely difficult. Every time you have a Democratic president and a majority in both houses of Congress, there have been attempts at labor law reform. 4 times under Johnson, under Carter, under Clinton, and then under Obama, and all four have failed, which is why we're proposing kind of a fresh approach to, rather than simply changing labor law reform or engaging in labor law reform, which some Americans see as kind of special interest legislation. We really think this should become a matter of civil rights, that you should have a basic right to try to organize a union and not be fired or discriminated against on that basis.
All right, so walk us through how would that work in a sort of a practical sense in the context of legislation that there's, statutes that already exist, and how would they be amended to reach that goal?
Well, that's right. So what we're talking about is taking the Civil Rights Act of 1964 as it's been amended, and right now that act provides that you can't fire someone or otherwise discipline them, discriminate on the basis of race, color, sex, religion, and national origin. And we're suggesting that we should add an additional category, that you shouldn't be fired on the basis of seeking union membership. So Title VII of the Civil Rights Act, which provides those protections, would be amended to include people who are simply trying to organize a union, become members of the middle class, that they shouldn't be fired for that reason.
Now, this isn't particularly unprecedented. I mean, we have labor laws, we have civil rights, I should say, that cover instances and in workplaces that are not simply a function of what we see in terms of Title VII. I mean, if you're pregnant, you can't be discriminated against because of prior criminal conviction in some instances, or whistleblowing. I mean, there are other instances, right, where your whatever would where you're protected from being fired because of those contexts.
That's right, and that's a very important point, because some people make the argument the Civil Rights Act should only apply to so-called immutable characteristics, something you can't change, like your race or national origin. And the point that we're trying to make in proposing the labor union addition is that there are all sorts of actions that are also protected, like if you call out your employer for engaging in environmental degradation or violating health and safety laws. There are whistleblower statutes. The issue of religion, which is in the original Civil Rights Act, points out the issue of volition. So if I'm a Christian and I convert to Islam, there's a choice involved in that, and yet that choice is protected. That you can't, an employer can't say, well, he chose to convert to Islam, therefore it's okay for me to discriminate against him. So the Civil Rights Act has been understood to apply not only to immutable characteristics, but also to protected actions, and that's where the idea of trying to exercise your right to join a union should be included under that rubric.
And we've seen, in instances like where you have industries that are protected not only by the National Labor Relations Act, but subsequent, like the Railway Labor Act, which actually has been somewhat in the news with the FAA authorization. but that workers in those industries that are covered by that, which I believe is sort of some of the major transportation and sort of shipping businesses, they tend to be more unionized, which is one indication of the implications of having laws that make it easier for people to exercise what you would say is a civil right.
That's right. The strength of the laws matters a great deal. So in the case of the Railway Labor Act, if an employer is firing people and engaging in unfair labor practices, there's a remedy available where they can go in and seek an injunction immediately and get that stopped. So the law makes a difference, and the law also creates a culture in our society. So the Civil Rights Act, when it was passed, helped create a culture in which employers now recognize that it is wrong and indeed shameful to engage in explicit racial discrimination. That same set of laws and culture does not exist with respect to labor organizing. And in fact, employers try to pick out and fire the ringleaders of a labor organizing movement precisely to send a message to the other employees that they ought to be scared if they ought not to engage in labor organizing. So the statute makes a big difference. And if you look at what has happened since Martin Luther King's assassination in 1968, when he was in Memphis trying to organize sanitation workers, we've seen really important progress on civil rights for African Americans and Latinos and others. Not enough progress, but things are headed in the right direction with a strong law. With respect to labor, we're seeing the opposite. With a weak law since '68, we've seen a big decline in labor, and with that, an enormous increase in inequality. That's a point I guess I'd like to emphasize, that there are lots of things that are being suggested to address what President Obama has called the defining issue of our time, the rising inequality. There's the Buffett rule on taxes. Some people are proposing better spending on education, those sorts of things, all of which I support. But if we want to have a really big impact on economic inequality, we have to address the collapse of organized labor in this country. And it seems to me that recognizing the civil right to unionize would have an important impact.
Frustration. Don't you see? I can't hold my aggravation. No. I see people dying.
In terms of the practical implications, you mentioned that the Railway Labor Act allows for a worker to force an injunction against a corporation that is engaging in unfair labor practices. In the context of industries that are not covered under the Railway Labor Act, it's the opposite, where corporations have the ability to file injunctive relief against the union that is engaging in policies or engaging in activities that go outside of that are found illegal under Taft-Hartley. But the union, when you fire a worker, like you said at the beginning of this interview, their relief comes 7 or 8, 10 months down the road, and is just a tiny fine, which is just a cost of doing business. And so let me ask you this just finally. Obviously, this is not a game plan that we're going to be able to execute now, and going forward, why do you think it'll be easier at the end, in the long run, to get I guess it would be Title VII of the Civil Rights Act to be amended, if that's what you're proposing? Why would that be easier ultimately than any other type of reform?
Yeah, well, that's a great question because, as I mentioned earlier, we've tried labor law reform 4 times, and it hasn't worked even with Democratic majorities in Congress. The main distinctions, to my mind, between the civil rights approach and the labor law reform approach is that the civil rights approach, first off, fits better into our country's emphasis on individual rights. Now, I'm someone who values on solidarity.
I'm sorry.
And in this case,
I'm sorry.
I think we can.
Richard, you cut out for there a minute. So you were just saying you're someone who values.
Who values solidarity, the solidarity, people coming together in the labor movement to advance their collective interests. I think that's an important value. But at the same time, in this country, the fact is that we're culturally all about individual rights, and by amending the Civil Rights Act, we better comport with that fundamental idea that we ought to protect individual rights. And so the notion would be, if you are an individual out there and you're part of an effort to try to organize a union, you shouldn't be fired for exercising that right. The second distinction is that civil rights are rightly recognized as a moral issue. So people who are in school learning about the history of this country, they understand the moral values that infused the civil rights movement, whereas labor law reform in the past has been seen as special interest legislation that doesn't really excite people the way that civil rights does. And so to my mind, for both of those reasons, it will be far easier to pass efforts to improve the strength of the unions in this country by emphasizing the civil rights approach as opposed to the traditional labor law reform approach.
And I would add to that I think it would increase people's awareness of just how curtailed your rights become when you are doing it under the auspices of a union as opposed to any other endeavor. Because, when you're not allowed to show your support because for someone else who is striking or, involved in some type of action against a company or a corporation or an industry, simply because you're a union member, that to me just seems bizarre, frankly. And I'm not sure enough people are aware of that.
That's right. Hopefully these discussions will bring those points out. And, we've seen in Wisconsin and Ohio, when the fundamental right to collective bargaining was attacked by Republican governors in the public sector context, that Americans have responded, and they think that they realize that there is this fundamental right that exists, and it may be that now finally we're seeing people energized on this issue, given the conservative overreach.
I hope you're right. Richard Kahlenberg, senior fellow at Century Foundation, author, co-author of Why Labor Organizing Should Be a Civil Right. Appreciate your time today.
Okay, well, thank you so much for having me, Sam.
So I believe it was yesterday. It was reported that a U.S. Army sergeant killed at least 16 civilians, 9 of whom were children, in a part of southern Afghanistan. The story, there are conflicting reports as to how many people were involved in this. The official story is that this one Army sergeant, who was part of a specific unit which functioned to organize local police units and track down Taliban in the southern part of Afghanistan, left his base in the middle of the night, I guess traveled a mile, and then started banging on doors in a local village and just shooting up people, and then grabbed them once they were dead and attempted to burn a bunch of them. You're talking about 9 children, 4 of them girls younger than 6. He has been deployed to Afghanistan or Iraq at least one other time in the past. There's obviously mixed information. There are reports that multiple witnesses, though not the preponderance of witnesses, at least according to the New York Times and the AP, said that they saw other soldiers. Now, it's unclear whether or not they saw other soldiers who came in after the fact or during it, but it does seem sort of stretch the imagination slightly that this guy was able to at least to kill people and then attempt to gather them together to burn them. It's unclear. But one of the most disturbing things that struck me in reading this story, because we're going to hear how this lone gunman was crazy, how he lost control of himself, how this is not indicative of anything. New York Times reports the killings came 2 days after an episode in the Kapisa province in eastern Afghanistan, in which NATO helicopters apparently hunting Taliban insurgents fired on civilians, killing 4 and wounding another 3. This is ongoing in Afghanistan. And the idea that it's one lone gunman who did this, one soldier who went crazy who did this, is the problem, is completely understating and underselling what the problem is. The problem is that we are constantly, on a weekly if not daily basis, killing civilians in this country.
Don't you shoot him down. He's about to leave here. Don't you shoot him down. He's got to stay here. He ain't going nowhere. He's been shot down to the ground. No way he can survive. No, no.
And nobody can really explain why. What it is that we're supposed to be doing there. You know, we had that moment where the country could rejoice, those who wanted to, in the killing of Osama bin Laden. Well, where's the dividends for that? If we're going to, it's bad enough that we have to reduce this country in terms of its moral stature from where it was when it could actually try crimes against humanity, to now where we just simply assassinate people, or targeted killing, I should say. But why couldn't we use that event as a reason to get out of a quagmire where all we seem to be doing is treading water at the expense of innocent civilians? It's really just a horrible, horrible shame. And hopefully we will get out of that country sooner rather than later. But, you know, for those who suggest that there's a presidential candidate who is going to be more apt to get out of Afghanistan, and that candidate is Mitt Romney, I would tend to disagree. We just in this country don't have enough popular desire that is manifested anyways to stop killing civilians.
And walk away. And the last one and all the laps been erased. And the last person to the violence of pleasure. Seeing another smiling face. And we lose the reason for the vision. And the separation has gone away. When we know the love will stay. When all the songs have been heard. When all the books have been read. When all the hate is gone and dead. There will come a day when that will be. No more enemy, no one left to wait. Now on this day, we'll stand up and walk away.
Policing of crooked local police that's going on in Oakland. That'd be great if that happened more often.
It's just it literally saying limiting government. Until I tell you what my plans are and how I would limit government is like saying we need to make the government more blue. Don in Atlanta, welcome to the program, Don.
Sam, what's going on, brother?
How you doing?
Hey, I'm not a libertarian, but ask me why I'm a libertarian.
Why are you a libertarian?
Because I'm a libertarian, Sam. Let me explain further. Carpet, sand, smaller government, computer. Do you understand what I'm saying, brother?